Welcome back, everyone, to the Chiefs Catalyst podcast, designed to provide short, insightful, and informative episodes for the dynamic public safety leaders of today. The Chiefs Catalyst is for those who are looking for ways to streamline their departmental operations and increase efficiency and effectiveness through people, strategies, and technologies. If you like what you hear or want to discuss a topic further, send us an email at catalystpodcast@proton.me. Thank you for joining us today, everybody, on this part 2 episode of analysts being the masters of data in our agency. As we think strategically for law enforcement leaders and crime analysts in our sector, it's really important, like we talked about, that you have somebody who can speak to your data, who knows your data intimately, and who can help you actually do something with all of this data that you've collected, that person being the analyst. On this special episode, I have a guest with me today, Amanda Bruner from CNA, the Center for Naval Analysis, who's going to talk a little bit about her background, how she helps people do evidence-based policing, and some of her perspective and experience on being a data master and helping analysts and chiefs understand this concept. So, Amanda, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and how you got into law enforcement?
Absolutely. So I went to Michigan State University for an undergraduate in criminal justice. And at about that time was when I first learned about analysis. My cousin Scott was working for the Ohio State Highway Patrol at the time. And I went and toured their unit, kind of learned a little bit from him about analysis, what analysis was. And it was kind of another career option, right? As a CJ undergrad, you're told you can become a cop or a lawyer. And then there was this other world of analysis, but I didn't really know too much. So at that time, I'm going through undergrad. I interned at a couple of different police departments. I learned that I was going to be best serving an agency from behind a desk rather than in a cop car. So I kind of continued exploring. And at that point, I did an internship with the Charlotte DEA office and had a chance to shadow their analysts. And that was the first time I saw CDRs and geofence returns and all of that kind of stuff. And I really was able to understand what an analyst could do to help support an organization. And then following that internship, I was an intern and then a part-time analyst for the Michigan State University Police Department with their crime and intelligence analyst. And that was when I really saw that local level, how crime analysis can drive deployment strategies, problem solving, communication with the public, and so forth. And so after I graduated, I entered in a master's program for law enforcement intelligence and analysis, also through Michigan State. And I started working for Bank of America as a corporate intelligence specialist. That position heavily focused on open source investigations, especially in Hong Kong at the time, which was quite a bit of a change from what I had been working in. But again, a different way to examine data, research different topics, people, events, and so forth. I then transitioned from there to the Matthews Police Department, a suburb of Charlotte, North Carolina, where I started their crime analysis unit, which was a very traditional local crime analysis program. And we did follow the stratified policing model. So learned quite a bit about implementing evidence-based practices and how to support problem solving as an analyst. And then about 2 years ago, almost now, just under 2 years, I moved over to the CNA Corporation. And so now I do support the Crime Analysts in Residence, Project Safe Neighborhoods, and Public Safety Partnership programs, which are all grant-funded programs, where I travel to different agencies to provide crime analysis training and technical assistance, working with different systems, working with different policies, and so forth to boost up analytical capacity.
That is fantastic. And so highlight reel, what you're saying is that if we need help starting a crime analysis unit or getting a crime analyst program at our agency, you're the one we should call.
Absolutely. And I will put out there, shameless plug, crimeanalystinresidence.com. It is a free grant program to small and rural agencies. We are still accepting new agencies into that program, and we are nationwide. So it's entirely free. There's no catch. There's applications on there, and you can see and read case studies about some of the graduated sites as well.
We will drop the link in the bio of this episode. But I think you hit a couple of key points in when you talked about your experience in your career on analysts being a key support function to the department. Oftentimes, I think we think of analysts as like this ancillary function or this background function. But truly, if you're going to be in an evidence-based policing practice, or if you're going to work in a data-driven model, then your analyst is your key linchpin to help move that model forward. But also, they're key to that problem-solving element, whether it's through collaboration, creativity, innovation. You and I have talked about this before, but we know we're facing the most dynamic, diverse, creative enterprise in the world, and that is criminal entities, whether it's on a local level, whether it's on a state or national level. We're working with against enterprises, whether, like I said, local or multinational conspiracies, that we have to get creative with how do we solve these problems from the small to the large. And the analysts really serve that key function. So we've talked a little bit about the last episode, or the first part of this episode, for analysts being the master of data. And so with your experience at your prior agencies and throughout your career helping analysts become masters of data, what are some of the things that you have found that are really important for analysts to do or be at their agency to own that master of data role?
So I really think that this process is twofold. There's the role of prevention, and then there's also the role of kind of dealing with what you have. So oftentimes I talk to analysts, and there's a common notion put out there that my data's dirty, I can't do anything with it, I can't create those products, there's issues with the data, officers don't put this information in the report, and so forth. And there are things that you can work as an analyst to rectify in the system. So for example, at my agency, I worked with records to help clean up the master address file and improve the latitude and longitude coordinates that were going on reports. So later on, that helped my process of mapping those incidents. With some of my agencies I've been working through the CAR program, we have worked with the records to connect the CAD and RMS systems together so that CAD information, which is validated, comes over into the RMS report. And so then officers are just adding a narrative, but that location information that's validated transfers. Same thing with helping to modify procedures, whether it's how records are purged, things like that. That again, you can work with records to help kind of be preventative for how things are entered into the system. With that, you can also create new products that help to collect data. So for example, one of the big things in my agency was they wanted to track staffing levels. How many officers on average did we have working? How many supervisors on average did we have working? Well, that was not something that was tracked in our CAD because it didn't differentiate if they were on patrol versus if they were on off duty versus if they were light duty in the office and so forth. So we created a sheet that was called our daily occurrence that was in our SmartForce page, our SharePoint platform, that helped track that information. And then that could be analyzed to say, we had these average number of staff members per shift. And that was something that answered that question. It wasn't something we previously collected. So those are all things that an analyst can do to help change processes that make your job easier in the end. However, the opposite of that is everything you have up until this point is inherently dirty, right? We don't work with clean data. The academic exports that you get in school, you'll never see those again in the real world. So how can analysts work with dirty data? And I think the big thing there is really learning how you can clean it. So whether that's learning about leading or trailing spaces and how you can trim those fields, left and right functions, how you can transform data types, so text, date. So for example, if an integer is stored as text, and being very knowledgeable and intimate with those data sets and how the tables in your RMS connect. So for example, I'm working with an agency right now. They changed their process of how an OCA number was generated for an incident report. It used to have a dash, it doesn't now. Well, that's going to create issues. So by having that intimate knowledge, you can put in a process where we're going to take the left 3 digits and the right 4 digits, and we're going to combine it into a new field. And that's going to be our OCA that we're going to create our visualization off of. So that intimate knowledge is key. So those are all things that you can obviously do after the fact. Same thing, I give another example here. I see a lot of agencies deal with this where they change district or area boundaries. So you go from 5 districts to 4 beats or whatever it is. well, that's not captured in my RMS. I can't do historical comparisons. Or we just absorbed our ETJ. Well, you can create a model in Arc Pro where you map these points, conduct a spatial join, and assign that new area to that. So one of my colleagues, Charlie Gibberti, and I have been working on this with several different agencies so we can actually do true historical comparisons of beat 4 this year versus beat 4 last year and so forth. The data doesn't have that, but we have the tools at our disposal where we can help visualize this, add additional fields, modify those existing fields, and so forth.
Lots of really great points there throughout everything you said. But starting with finding your data, you touched on it, but we have to have open access, right? That involves being able to touch all of the data points that we capture. In previous episodes, when we talked about data sources, our CAD and RMS is meant to do one thing really well, and that's capture and store data. And it's in all of these different data points. But you also mentioned using a SharePoint list or something outside of your CAD and RMS to capture specific data. Maybe it was for your operations and your staffing. Maybe it was for specific complaints or operational discussions. But however it happened or was logged, your analyst has to have access to that key data in order to do something with it, in order to even start cleaning it. And then, like you said, they have to develop that process to figure out where is it dirty, and then what can I do with it, or what could I do with it before, and now what should I look to do with it? Where Google is our friend, and we reach out and talk to other people and say, hey, how did you do this? Because I know starting out as an analyst, there's a lot of things that I didn't know that we have to sit and learn. We learn through the GTS model. Google that stuff, right? Or network. Chat GPT, right, appropriately in the right context with the right safeguards. But another key element there I like that you touched on in working with your records department is that teamwork and collaboration aspect. I tell folks all the time, locally when working with their IT departments or with other departments in their town, like I say it kind of jokingly, but take your IT people cookies, take your records people cookies and say, hey, I need to talk to the CAD administrator. I need the CAD administrator to be my friend because we want to do these cool things. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that our geolocation or our latitude and longitude is accurate, that our call types are actually what we're pulling, that our offense types or secondary call types are accurate. And you're not the one who may touch those. Maybe you are, depending on your agency size, but you need those relationships with your CAD administrator and with your records person. You need backing from your chief. You need your IT people to be on board, especially if maybe you're in an agency that is, you have your own police department, but you're dispatched out of a regional center. Who owns that data? Do you have to go get it from somebody else? We have to have that partnership and that teamwork collaboration aspect in order to accomplish that really well.
And I would even add to that. So when we talk about being a master of your own data, inherently in our position of a crime analyst, we analyze data. You have to have access to data, right? And so having that ODBC connection, being able to extract data out of these systems, having APIs is inherently required to do our jobs. Now, absolutely, you can export CSVs and Excel and so forth from the front end, and you can still build out processes. It's not that you can't do the job, but it really does limit your capacity to build automated processes. But with that, as you mentioned here with the partnerships with IT, the CAD and RMS administrators is also advocating for the analyst at that command level when an agency is picking a new RMS, a new CAD, who owns that data, where is that data stored, how is that data accessible. Some RMS vendors require a reporting server. Some of them are a little bit more easy to work with than others may be. And so having that understanding, but also being able to advocate for your position and having those relationships where you have a partner in the room versus an adversary can be beneficial in the long term.
I realized just then we've used a couple technical terms that we might not have defined, but when we see ODBC, we're talking about open database connections. And she can probably give you a better definition here, but basically it allows your analyst to reach in and touch the raw data in the fields that they're captured in, rather than maybe the automated reports that may dump out of your CAD and RMS. I know, for instance, at my home agency, there's a lot of custom reports that they built for certain agencies that were available to every agency that used their CAD and RMS product. but they were all generated to be viewed in a PDF. And so even when you look at a table of them on the PDF, when you put it in an Excel spreadsheet, it was a Excel spreadsheet that was formatted to be viewed in a PDF because it was not meant to be transformed or visualized in any way. And so when I said, hey, I want to visualize it, they were like, whoa, this is this you want to do, you want to do what, right? Can we just make you a special report? I'm like, no, I need all of the data in the fields that they're in, because I'm not manipulating the data. I still want it in the form and the content that it, or context that it came in, but I need to be able to say this equals a Monday, this equals a Tuesday. These IBR codes may equal part 1 crimes or part 2 crimes or violent or crimes against persons, property, whatever it is. If you don't have that open database connection, it adds an extra layer of challenge for your analysts in doing that regular work. I know for us, when we worked on getting that ODBC connection, it saved me an average of like 15 hours a week in data cleaning. And I helped an agency recently that used our same CAD provider, because they were like, hey, we need to do like our yearly numbers compared to everybody else, and we just don't know how to do it with this data. So I sat down and I was like, oh man, I truly have saved so much time by having that free and open access to my data than having to sit here and waste valuable resources moving things around in Excel or trying to write and run a macro, where an ODBC is super helpful.
And I think that it's also important to emphasize for any commanders and chiefs listening that ODBC connection is established from a read-only perspective. So when we talk about the front end and the back end of a system, the front end would be where an officer enters information into it. They're typing their report. The back end, where the analyst is pulling data from, it's read only. So while we can see these tables of raw data, I can't go in there and delete a report or delete a record or modify the date or time on that. So it's truly just a tool where we can take that data out, then visualize it in Power BI, ARC Pro, Excel, whatever it is. But it does maintain the integrity of the data itself in the system.
While we're talking about Power BI and data visualizations, you and I have talked about this just in recent days, but being able to visualize your data helps to tell a story. I'm sure as you, a chief or a captain or a supervisor, an analyst, if they've come to you with a spreadsheet and said, look, this is what our crime is doing, it doesn't make sense to you. And it's for sure not going to make sense to the layperson or your counsel who are concerned about those things, or your average citizen. Whereas if you can visualize your data and put it in, whether it's Excel, whether it's PowerPoint, whether it's Power BI, and build them a chart or a graph or a picture to look at that truly tells the story of your data, it's so much more impactful than just numbers on a spreadsheet.
Yeah, I always talk to agencies about, if we're able to tell you that you had 13 burglaries in the last 14 days, what does that do for you? But if we visualize that data and we have a time of day, day of week heat map that shows when those were occurring, we have a map in our Power BI dashboard that shows that there's a cluster over here, and we actually map our arrests, and we can see that we had a recent individual arrested in that area for burglary. That gives you context to what you're doing. That starts the problem-solving process. That 13 burglaries were up from last week didn't really start that conversation. All we know is it's a problem, but we don't know anything more about it.
Right back onto solving problems and being creative with it. But yeah, those visualizations are important. So moving kind of forward here, as masters of data, how do we as analysts then support implementing evidence-based policing practices in using this data and these visualizations?
So I will reference here to some of the teachings from the Santoses. I know you and I are both students of Santos, and within stratified policing, obviously that is an accountability model that helps operationalize proactive crime reduction. But I think that there's a key component in here that transcends stratified policing and relates to crime analysis and the profession as a whole. And it's a comparison that dispatch is to a call for service as a crime analyst is to a product. And what I'm getting at there is that every agency has a policy for how officers respond to a call for service that the dispatcher puts out on the radio. These are priority calls. These you respond to priority 2, priority 3. These calls you take reports for. This is what you put in the report, and so forth. all of that is very well documented by a police agency. If you were to ask those same agencies how many of them have a policy that's not just for CALIA about the crime analyst position itself, but is actually a policy about what happens when an analyst puts out a product, it's very few. And that piece right there, that call for service that leads to the incident report is just one. That analytical product that says we've had 5 motor vehicle thefts that are related deserves that same response. And that's where we start getting into problem solving, the implementation of evidence-based responses, when you have that accountability component where there is a response required when the problem is identified. And I think that this all is wrapped up into the SARA model, right? So we scan, we analyze, we respond, and we assess. Your analyst is scanning, determining these problems, there's conversation. The analyst provides that analysis. What's next? The response. Obviously, analysts play a role in each part of the SARA model in each step. However, the response stage inherently is more of a responsibility for those sworn personnel, but you have to give them something to respond to. Again, going back to that 13 burglaries, you've got to give them something more that's action-oriented rather than just situational awareness.
Absolutely. I think you're exactly right. It makes me think back to a saying we used to have in 911 communications. There's a t-shirt that says, "Dispatch tells cops where to go." And sometimes cops don't like to hear that. And truthfully, it's not us. It's where the citizens are telling us that we need to go. But when an analyst can make a educated recommendation on where our problems are based on what the citizen generated data is telling us, then you can take your supervisors that have advanced technical knowledge. They know how to be good cops. They know how to make good arrests. They're familiar with their penal code, their code of criminal procedure, and conducting good patrol or investigative work, and then putting those skills to use in the areas where they can have the most impact. Because we're never going to have enough cops. We're never going to have enough cars. We're always going to want the newest and the latest and the greatest and more. But at the end of the day, there's only so many pieces of the pie that can be cut, or the pieces can only be so big. And so in one hand, we're stuck with the people and the resources that we have. So we have a responsibility then to deploy those resources in the most effective and efficient way possible. And using your analysts to do so is where you really get the bang for your buck. Because then it's saying, hey, out of all the people, out of all the places that we could go and do, this is the area where we can actually reduce citizens' complaints because we have BMVs or we're having repeat incidences. Even if it's as simple as like noise disturbances or some type of civil issue that's just a repeat call for service, we can make an impact there and potentially mitigate future problems by letting the data lead us to those problems, rather than just sitting around waiting for those problems to pop up and then we address them.
Yeah, and two, I love that you mentioned repeat incidents there. And so I think that we produce a very similar report with agencies in which we look at a rolling 28-day time period to identify short-term clusters and calls for service. And a traditional repeat report, whether it's in stratified policing or other models, looks for domestic disturbance, noise complaints, more quality of life issues that may lead or show a tendency for escalation. So if we're able to identify this address that in the last month has had 3 or 4 of these citizen-generated calls for service, that indicates there's a problem. That next call may be an ag assault, right? And so to kind of prove this point, with one of the agencies I worked with, we did a retroactive analysis. We looked at all of our ag assaults, pulled all of the associated calls for service, and showed what percentage of those addresses would have appeared on a repeat report had it been being produced at that time. And we were able to identify a number of those addresses where there could have been possible intervention should that report have been produced. So again, it kind of helps give credibility to the analysis. But again, it's really focusing in and being cognizant of the manpower that the agency has, and that the crime analyst truly is a force multiplier, right? In the sense that officers can patrol an area, but statistically speaking, as soon as they leave that complex, their deterrence goes to 0. So how can we put them in the most crime dense or quality of life issue areas to maximize their time on patrol? And analysts help dictate some of those or help direct some of those strategies.
Absolutely. And all of which, I don't know that we've talked about it here yet, but all of which supports the goals that your chief or your administration or your elected officials or governing body has set. Because everybody's AOR or jurisdiction is different, right? If you're a school police department, if you're a state police department, if you're a federal agency, if you're a local agency, even just local to local, depending on how many apartment complexes you have or how many neighborhoods or how many commercial areas you have, your priorities may change. And so you can't have just one shotgun approach. Hey, this is how you do, this is what you need to respond to across every single agency in America. Yes, we want to reduce crime, but you have to know what crime is important to your agency to reduce. Because if you don't know what problems lie in your jurisdiction, if you don't have BMVs because you're an apartment complex or you're a mall and you don't worry about parking lots, you're only concerned about the inside, or the airport just inside, it doesn't help you to solve BMVs or whatever type of crime it is. I rely on BMVs because it's an easy thing to revert back to. But you have to know from your data what calls are important and then what's important to your administration, your chief. Maybe they're like, hey, we don't care about BMVs. We just want to see fraud go down. Okay, well, now you got to get creative to figure out how to decrease fraud. Hint, hint, decrease your BMVs, you decrease that fraud. But however it looks, you need to see what your problems are within your agency or within your area of responsibility, and then address those strategically.
And I think that relates back to knowing your data intimately. So I actually had this conversation with Cassie Langdon, who works for Holly Springs Police Department in North Carolina, about understanding where your known offenders and your repeat offenders come from. Do they live in your jurisdiction? Do they come from the neighboring city? Do you need to have a partnership for recent arrest information? How do you collaborate with other analysts in your area? But again, that comes from understanding your data, the crime in your jurisdiction, and what's driving some of those problems more specifically.
All really, really great points. I know that we're nearing the close of our episode today, and I think hopefully in this short amount of time, we've given you some good thoughts or some good talking points moving forward as you talk about maybe adding a crime analyst to your deck or redefining their roles and responsibilities within your agency. Like Amanda said, to truly get the most out of your analyst and give them the best chance for success. We've talked about today a lot of stratified policing accountability model, because we both are, like she said, students of the Santos. We'll drop a link for the stratified policing accountability model book. It's a really easy, simple read, and even if it's not something that your agency goes on to practice, it's a good starting point to think about and see maybe what types of strategies your agency might need to look at moving forward to have an evidence-based or data-driven approach to reducing crime. Also, we'll drop a link for the Crime Analyst in Residence program. I would encourage you, check it out. Talk about it with your cities as you're coming up within budget. If it's not something that your city is budgeting for, then absolutely look at grant funded positions, especially like this, where you can actually get help starting up these programs and making the most use out of them. Amanda, any final parting thoughts or words before we close down for today?
No, I think that this has been a wonderful discussion, and I hope it encourages continued conversations about analysts using data, and really just kind of opens up that discussion further with sworn personnel, especially as it relates to selecting vendors, implementing policy, and so forth in an agency.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I've appreciated this discussion and having you on, and we'll definitely have you on again in the future. If you like what you've heard today, feel free to let us know. We'd invite you to subscribe to or follow the podcast on the links in the platform that you're using. If you have questions, comments, or you want to talk more about this, please feel free to drop us an email at catalystpodcast@proton.me, and we hope to see you here next time.